Eruption 14.2, the Annexation of Arizona and Nevada, Part 2. Initially, the Civil Defense Forces were primarily recruited from other law enforcement agencies, such as the California Highway Patrol and the county sheriff departments from Arizona and Nevada. Alas, it became clear very quickly that policing the territories would require thousands of officers, and it would become impossible to staff civil defense while also meeting the needs of law enforcement within California itself. The National Service program was initiated within the California National Guard after a contentious vote in the Californian Senate. The program would allow National Guard soldiers to take leave to attend a law enforcement crash course that would give them basic police training and allow them to be sworn in as peace officers. These soldiers would be hired on as civil defense officers while still officially being on leave from the CNG. By June of 1994, thousands of these new officers were ready to take to the streets. They brought with them dozens of former U.S. military vehicles and combat gear, careful not to bring anything the Americans weren't also using to avoid giving away the Californian military's latest capabilities. Humvees and cargo trucks made up most of the frontline patrol vehicles, while variants of the M113 and M2/M3 Bradleys were called in when more firepower was needed. Contrary to many reports at the time, there were no recorded instances of actual main battle tanks being deployed by civil defense, although there were some engineering vehicles based on the M60 used for repairing infrastructure damaged in gunfights with the outlaws. That being said, the average civilian didn't seem to care if the vehicle barreling down their street was technically a tank or not. It had tracks and a big cannon pointed at them. That was all that mattered. The vehicle crews quickly spray painted over the California National Guard on the sides and replaced it with Civil Defense in reflective letters. Many units also installed light bars and sirens on the roofs of their vehicles, again in an almost sarcastic attempt to show they were police. For day-to-day activities, civil defense officers wore tan uniforms borrowed from the Highway Patrol. However, when on raids or long patrols in the desert, they would don special gray camouflage tactical gear. Ostensibly, this was done to help them blend in to the volcanic ash in the eruption zone, although in reality, it was for intimidation more than anything. In a similar vein, they also took to wearing bandanas over their noses and mouths, supposedly to protect themselves from breathing in the volcanic ash and dust, but it also conveniently worked to conceal their identities. This gave rise to the popular nicknames Bandidos or Diablo Californiano being bestowed upon them. The first assignment for civil defense was patrolling the deserts along the southern border of Arizona and the eastern border of California, with the theory being that this would cut off shipments of drugs from the south and corral the outlaws in Arizona and Nevada so they could be apprehended. Civil defense came in literally guns blazing, bringing heavy weapons such as machine guns and armor-piercing LAW rockets that the smugglers were not at all prepared for. Again, in theory, they were supposed to be police, and their priority was supposed to be apprehending the smugglers and bringing them to justice. In practice, however, there were very few arrests. The rules of engagement were such that any suspicious vehicle is to be given a warning shot and ordered to stop immediately. If those commands are not followed, it is to be treated as hostile. Due process and Miranda rights disappeared into the desert winds. Part of the problem with arresting the criminals was that there had been no clear protocol established as to what would happen to a detained suspect. Because the U.S. did not formally recognize the Californian government, they refused to set up any sort of extradition agreement, as doing so could be taken as a tacit acknowledgement of their sovereignty. Obviously, those apprehended in Californian territory would be sent to a Californian court for arraignment. In the remote desert regions of Arizona and Nevada, many counties still had no permanent population and therefore no courts or even jails to haul them off to. Granted, many of the outlaws were charged with U.S. federal crimes, so in theory they should have been taken to the nearest U.S. federal court to be held there until their trial. Though, since the officers doing the apprehending were Californian, if they resisted arrest or were caught committing a Californian felony, they had every right to bring them back to California to be charged. The paperwork for an officer-involved shooting was easier to navigate than trying to individually negotiate the extradition of individual offenders, and as such, that became the de facto option. June turned to July. The initial reception of civil defense was quite positive on both sides of the US/California border. Out in the desert, there was no one to report on the atrocities taking place, and the shock of their arrival did curb the mayhem in the cities. Ironically, many of the outlaws of the border region were now forced to flee into the cities, since the border was closed, and they had no way of returning to Mexico. If they weren't killed outright by civil defense, there still was no food or water to be had. They would attempt to blend into the civilian population in hopes that civil defense would loosen their grip on the border and be able to return. By the end of August, Phoenix, Tucson, and Vegas had all been effectively encircled by civil defense. Roadblocks had been erected to try and catch the desert outlaws as they entered the cities. In reality, they served only to harass the citizens and the supply trucks coming in and out of the cities. The initial positivity around civil defense was fading fast in the territories. On August 30th, the governor of Nevada requested that civil defense stand down on the roadblocks and patrols in the suburban areas of Las Vegas, as the city police department, along with the mob, had no problem keeping order in the city. As per the agreement with the U.S., civil defense was supposed to respect the governor's authority and defer to local police, yet they refused to stand down. The next day, the governor of Arizona also asked for a stand down around Phoenix and Tucson, again receiving no response from civil defense. In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1994, civil defense began moving into the cities en masse. Citizens awoke to the sounds of gunfire and APCs rolling down city streets. Any resistance was met with lethal force, whether it be from the gangsters or the city police departments trying to intermediate the violence. The governor of California called an emergency, early morning press briefing, at which he claimed that the city governments were corrupt and in league with the gangsters. Warrants had been issued for the mayors and police chiefs of all three major cities at the stroke of midnight, and civil defense was moving in to make the arrests. As we've discussed, this wasn't entirely untrue. The city governments had absolutely made dealings with the criminal underworlds in the major cities. One could absolutely view this as corruption. Yet, these deals had kept the peace and made sure aid was given out equitably. The public still held their city governments in high esteem and viewed the gangsters even more favorably. Many wondered why civil defense felt the need to insert themselves in the situation. Tucson was the first to fall. Civil defense was able to roll straight down I-10 and then swarm City Hall and police headquarters before the police department even had a chance to organize a response. Both the mayor and the police chief were dragged out of their homes in their pajamas after a no-knock raid. Civil defense then spread out across the city to begin hunting known gang members. Initially, they were able to take Phoenix City Hall and the municipal buildings downtown as well, but given that Phoenix was a much larger city, police officers from different precincts around the city were able to respond. There was still a degree of mutual respect between civil defense and the local police in Phoenix, so they tried to act as mediators and keep the civil defense officers from just shooting people on sight. However, it had soon been reported that the mayor, police chief, and their staff had been escorted out of the city by the Maricopa County Sheriff and were now fleeing to the east. Any goodwill between civil defense and the cops had been shattered. The story was quite different in Vegas. The mob and their associates had foreseen that civil defense might try to crack down on them, and had quietly been making preparations for the assault. The outfit's 4 casinos, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina, were all fortified, and the thugs acting as guards were all assigned rooms on the lower floors so they could jump to the defense of the casinos if necessary. The mayor's family had relocated to the penthouse suite at the Stardust and given bodyguard protection 24/7. When civil defense began their assault on the morning of September 1st, the bikers and street gangs deputized by the mob immediately began opening fire on civil defense as they drove through the city streets. This alerted the gangsters holed up inside the casinos, who took up defensive positions. Civil defense initially showed restraint in deploying their heavier weapons, as destroying the casinos would also destroy any supplies and kill any civilians inside. After all, they were supposedly there to save the city, not destroy it. Civil defense surrounded the casinos and gave the mob 24 hours to surrender. The ensuing standoff gave both sides time to make sure the civilians had been evacuated from the casinos and the downtown area. From the hotel, the mayor made a desperate plea to the U.S. government to send in the U.S. military to either calm the situation down or deal with the Californians. The U.S. was still extremely reluctant to send the U.S. National Guard into civilian areas after the atrocities committed in the refugee camps after the eruption. Plus, it was not clear who even had authority over the border region, as the Nevada state government had collapsed after the eruption and was not subsequently re-established when Nevada lost its statehood. Both the president and Congress were reluctant to make the call to send in the troops, and U.S. military high command was certainly not going to make any moves into a city without the consent of both. The 24-hour mark passed while the debate raged on. Civil defense began the assault by firing tear gas into the ground floors of the casinos, to which the gangsters responded with automatic weapon fire. The Bradleys and APCs opened fire with their autocannons, laying waste to the facades of the buildings. The breaching teams were able to make it into the Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina. However, the inside of the Stardust had been too heavily fortified for them to make it inside. One of the Bradleys then exploded after a car bomb that it had parked next to was detonated. The perimeter team started taking fire from behind them. The city police had turned on them and sided with the mayor and his goons. The order was given for civil defense to fall back to the other casinos, and the scene quickly devolved into a full melee. The Battle of the Strip had begun. The fighting quickly spread up and down the Strip and devolved into brutal urban combat. Until this point, the only aircraft civil defense had utilized were unarmed police and transport helicopters, so one can imagine the shock of seeing several Huey gunships roaring over the city, again with civil defense hastily stenciled on their tails. The mayor tried to escape from the Stardust and flee back to the States like the mayor of Phoenix. However, the gunships spotted the motorcade of armored limousines. They unleashed a salvo of rockets on the convoy. When the dust settled, the mayor, his family, the police chief, and several mafia associates, including the Spilatro brothers and Frank Lefty Rosenthal, had been killed in the attack. Stunned news cameras had caught the entire attack on live TV. The world had finally gotten to witness the brutality of civil defense, and the United States was finally compelled to act. To be continued.